Hi. As promised, I'm here doing a short video on the concepts of ontology and epistemology. I realize and understand that these are very frustrating, confusing, and abstract concepts. So that's why I want to illustrate what they're about by focusing on a particular example. Just to reiterate, what is it that they mean, sort of in an abstract sense? So ontology, it's something about the world that we are investigating. How and to what degree is it real and independent from us? Just like we investigate planets and we can somehow argue that we are pointing to them out there in the world or an atom. And on the other hand, we have concepts like motivation or similar, where it's not as easy to say, look, it's right there. Similarly, epistemology, it's how can we claim to know what we know, or what's the standard of knowledge? Again, fairly abstract take we have here. So let me try to illustrate it via a specific example of breastfeeding and how different positions that we have outlined in Guba will have different takes on what is going on when we try to explain what breastfeeding is about and whether it's good or bad for the baby and the mother, etc. So how can we explain human behavior and outcomes, and how are there different approaches in science for doing that? If we look at it sort of from an immediate and physiological perspective, it's clear that there is a positive impact of breastfeeding on the baby. We can track, measure, it's tangible. There is something called breast milk, and we know we more or less know the exact composition of it. It varies very little across mothers. So we know the nutritional value, we know the chemicals that flow from the mother to the baby. The constructs are somehow in the physical world. We can look at it, point to it, we can spill it on the table. And we know quite a bit about the relevant mechanisms, so the chemistry and the nutrition involved. And that's then in some way a point about ontology. Reality is out there, it's something we track. Maybe, as Kuhn will say, it's only an imperfect, processed sense we have of it. We don't maybe see the world as it is, but there is something out there that we could track. That's at least an argument that we can make. We have technologically very advanced scientific instruments that can measure these things. So that's also why our standards should be fairly high. We have some sophisticated technology, and we can, in a very unbiased way, try to measure what's going on here across all kinds of cultures and mothers and babies, etc. And sort of the standard for good knowledge, it's a little bit like when Tycho Brahe, the Danish astronomer, was looking into the sky and the solar system, planets, comets, that he was really going for making sure there was an uncontaminated perspective, that we don't want the wind to interfere. In the same way, when we look at breast milk, it should be possible to say, look, there's an independent objective standard that we are going for. Okay. So breast milk, very simply put, is good. It's good for all sorts of babies in all sorts of contexts. So we can very simply say that, yes, due to the composition of breast milk, there has a positive impact on all kinds of ways of measuring life quality of a baby. Seems to be a good, clear explanation and causal relation. But let's try to make this a bit more complicated, because breastfeeding can also be painful for the breastfeeding mother. And considering the positive physiological impact on the baby, one could just say, well, tough luck, you should just do it anyway. Because look, you want to do what's best for the baby, right? But what about the socio-psychological impact of painful breastfeeding? It might lead to sleep deprivation, it might lead to low self-esteem or a feeling of lack of self-worth, and a mother might think negatively of herself. This is suddenly a completely different kind of concept, different kind of thing we're interested in. Can't really point to self-esteem in a sort of a tangible way like we can do with breast milk. Can't say, look, there it is. You're dealing with a different kind of construct. Whether we talk about being tired or feeling shame or whatever sort of particular construct we're evoking here. So we really have a key transition in the kind of concepts that we're talking about, the kind of the kind of world that we're looking at. So again, consider the concept that we had from the figure before. Physiological impact, very measurable. Even sleep, I guess you could not just measure how many hours and minutes you've slept, you could also in some way measure the quality of sleep. But the loss of self-worth or the loss of self-esteem, this is clearly a different kind of concept. We could still try to put it into a statistical analysis, and we could still try via a survey or something, try to measure the impact of lowering of self-esteem or the identity that this might have. But thinking in terms of ontology, we really seem to be dealing with a different kind of concept here. It's not as tangible like the benefits of breast milk. So again, it's not that I'm not saying a statistical quantitative analysis is not possible, but we have to realize that we suddenly facing different kinds of concepts, which also maybe means that we should have different standards for what a good explanation is, what a good explanation of what's going on is. So, and this is really the crucial part here. So, to what degree one feels shame depends on the norms in society, and if you get moral support from your friends and family. The nutritional value of breast milk doesn't in that same way depend on what others think or what others do or what you yourself think. But shame and self-identity, self-esteem, they are fundamentally different constructs. And they are constructed and being continuously constructed depending on the norms in the given society. Humans change, as Nelson argued in his 2016 paper. So let me be clear on this point here. In terms of the Yes Prime Minister challenge, the video that we saw in class, it's not just an epistemological challenge of how to phrase the right survey question. It's not just about how can I actually get to whatever is out there, but a mother will co-create her reality together with her friends and family and what they in turn think of not being able to breastfeed. We don't co-create our sort of physiological aspects of the benefits of breastfeeding and the benefits of breast milk in the same way. Breast milk is really independent from however we work as a society. But how we define shape of self-identity and how I as an individual human being cope with this and how I talk about this with my friends will really matter. And so depending on how I cope with this, depending on how I deal with this, and also just in more general, depending on the norms in society, we are in a situation where the underlying impact of not being able to breast milk will vary depending on these norms. Sorry. So again, just to be clear, we're dealing with I think we can argue we're dealing with two different worlds here. It's much easier to claim we are measuring something independent from us, something that is not constructed by us in any sense when focusing on the physiological perspective. The beneficial mechanisms and nutritional impact of this is sort of independent from our norms in our society. We might become better at measuring the impact. We might sort of update our ability to understand this in the future. We surely will be. But the societies we live in will directly shape how we think of ourselves and how we think of not being able to breastfeed. There's a very clear link here. That's how we can say that something is constructed. That's how a constructivist will argue that a concept or phenomena we're interested in is constructed by the beings that are living it, that we're actually investigating. So again, breast milk has different kind of ontological status, and we can then also expect a different kind of standard for when have we actually figured out the relation between breast milk and any kind of baby outcome. While the socio-psychological effects of painful breastfeeding is just a completely different kind of challenge to face. It's a different kind of world to investigate. We can't just point to self-esteem and say, look, there it is. We can try to measure it as well as possible, but it is some kind of hidden underlying concept that it's just not as tangible as breast milk. So that might then also impact what epistemological knowledge standards we should have and implement. How can we say that we will want to have a completely uncontaminated and pure perspective on the social, psychological, impact if we don't have a clear clearly identifiable social world to actually try to investigate. So the standard for when we actually know something should then probably be different. We should have different expectations for what we can know and how this might change over time, and how quickly this might change over time, depending on the culture and the norms that we are in. So I hope this gives some sense of what it means when we have some of the key quotes from the Guba text here. There is a real world driven by real natural causes. And it's easier to associate with the physiological impact of breast milk. It also acknowledges it might be imperfect, our measurements of it, and we, as Kuhn will argue, we don't have a perfect take on it. But it's hopefully then also more intuitive and clear that if we look at some of the quotations about constructivism that Guba has, something about how we have multiple realities and how we create the realities that we're interested in, well, that's then exactly the point, that's this concept of self-esteem. It will vary from person to person, and it can vary across norms and society. It's really a constructed norm that we are going by. It's a constructed norm that mothers might sort of respond to and abide to, more or less. And this is then what it means, that it's a constructed ontology, a constructed world that we're interested in. So different kind of concepts, different kinds of sort of the nature of different kinds of concepts will then lead to different standards for what can we expect a good explanation could be. Now I talked about breastfeeding and something that we don't really sort of focus on in our bachelor, but I hope that you can then also see that it could just as well have been firm performance or accounting or motivation or management or other similar constructs that we've heard about during our studies. Just to point back to Kuhn again, Kuhn will say that in both instances of physiology and the psychological factors, that they are constructed or processed, at least to some degree. We don't see the world as it really is. And one can sort of acknowledge that being true, but still then emphasize that there are differences between different kinds of worlds that you're interested in. Some are more independent from us, or some are more directly co-created by the activities that we engage in.